Hi everyone, I hope you're well. My name's Emily Yates. I'm an accessibility consultant and journalist, and I'm also a wheelchair user as well. And I'm here to talk to you today about the ethical and business benefits of access and inclusion from my own personal perspective. Now, I think when it comes to access and inclusion, we often think, oh, that venue's step free, that's got a ramp, we're accessible, we're inclusive, and we fail to actually see the other aspects of access and inclusion that are just as important. So I'll come on to these a little bit later. But first, I wanted to start with a really important quote that often gets people thinking. In a recent survey conducted by disability charity Scope, 66% of people said that they would actively avoid disabled people. With disabled people making up 20% of the world's population, that is a shocking statistic. So just think about that. 2/3 of the general public would actively avoid a disabled person given the opportunity to. And that is the way that we've got to go in society to really make it as inclusive to all as possible. I then wanted to talk to you a little bit about how access and inclusion isn't just a kind and ethical thing to do. So often we think, we're being really good citizens if we're making our venue or our offices accessible for disabled people out there. But actually it's a really great and profitable business model to be accessible. Now, there's something called the purple pound, and that just relates to the spending power of disabled people and their households. So for example, as a disabled person myself, my purple pound reaches for me, but also to my partner as well, and our spending power together is our purple pound. So just to give you a bit of an idea, that purple pound at the moment is worth £249 billion a year to UK businesses. £249 billion. And as I said earlier, 1 in 5 people in the UK, around 1 in 5 people are disabled. So that is a huge amount of spending power for them to have. Let's not forget that disabled people are consumers, they're customers. We like to spend money just like anybody else. And I think the really important thing to say with this as well, that we are particularly loyal customers. So again, looking at hotels or transport and travel, if your hotel, your airline provides particularly great access and inclusion, we will be back and we will recommend you to our friends. We are very loyal customers simply because it does take a little bit of time and effort to find things that are accessible and inclusive for us. So the purple pound is just something to really think about if you are a UK business and you want to really just see how you can market yourself a little bit better to the disabled community. Have a look at the purple pound, have a look at those statistics, and it will hopefully just change that mentality and perception that access and inclusion can be costly and it's really just a kind thing to do. No, it can be costly, but it will actually come back tenfold in the profit that it can make you and actually how you can be seen by the disabled community. So now I wanted to talk to you about something that I call physical versus social access. Now, when we think of accessibility, we so often think about ramps, tactile flooring, automatic doorways, and perhaps even having menus or information leaflets in easy read or large print formats. Now, these are all absolutely amazing and much needed things within society, but they do focus on physical access, how accessible the environment or even information is to disabled people. And I think what we so often forget or don't even realise exists is something called social access. Now, that is to do with our mentality and perception around disability. And I so often say to people, look, I could go into the most physically accessible venue out there. It could have step-free access, automatic doorways, lowered desks. But if once I got to the desk, to check in, to find out a little bit more about the leisure centre that I was going to, for example. And I was treated like a second-class citizen by a member of staff there who had a very low idea of what social access is and how that would work. Then that physical access that I'd just experienced that was so amazing wouldn't really count for all that much. So the social access is all around our mentality and perception around disability. And that so often relates to empathy, not sympathy. As disabled people, we don't want pity, we do want understanding. It so often relates to confident and comfortable communication instead of worrying about what you're going to say and whether or not it's going to be patronising or offensive, so really just ending up saying nothing at all. Let's make sure that when we're communicating with disabled people, we're communicating just as we would with anybody else. You know, it's considered calm, confident communication. And really, in my opinion, this good level of social access, especially within business, especially within customer service, is just as important as that physical access for a lot of disabled people. So again, just something to think about if you're wanting to reach a little bit further and be a little bit more aspirational in terms of access and inclusion and what your business can provide for disabled people. Another thing that's really important in terms of social access is not making assumptions and having a willingness to learn and be educated. I deliver some disability awareness training with a brilliant disability awareness charity called Enhance the UK. And quite often we go into a room full of 10, 12 delegates, and we might have a couple of people who've worked in that particular industry for a long time and are really quite against a group of disabled people coming in and telling them how to do it, or telling them how to slightly adapt what they've been doing for the last 30 years to make themselves a little bit more inclusive. And we often find that the problem is that people get quite defensive when it comes to disabled people and the idea of doing things correctly or incorrectly. But really, if you've got good social access, you will accept that a disabled person with lived experience will always be their own expert. They will always know exactly how they want to be treated, exactly how they want to be guided, for example, if they're blind or partially sighted. They'll know exactly how best to lip read you if they are deaf or hard of hearing, and that is okay. It's more than okay that that disabled person is their own expert. What's really important is that you accept that you're really open and willing to learn and be educated wherever possible. So don't make assumptions and don't get too defensive when it comes to helping disabled people and promoting good access and inclusion, because that's what good social access is all about. Throughout my time as an accessibility consultant, I've experienced great and awful physical access, and I've experienced really brilliant and not so brilliant social access as well. And I often find that the two are where you would least expect them to be. So I lived in Rio for 2 years. I was the accessibility consultant for the 2016 Olympic and Paralympic Games. And admittedly, the physical access in Rio was really quite difficult. It wasn't easy to live there, to get around as a wheelchair user. But one thing that I did find was that the social access was absolutely incredible. I only had to be crossing the road for 5 seconds and struggling to get up a curb, and somebody would just come and help me. And I think that there in particular, there wasn't the same awkwardness and worry about being offensive and patronising that we often find that there is in the UK. People worry so much about doing or saying the wrong thing that they don't bother doing anything at all. And I definitely didn't find that in Rio. Similarly, I have been on a plane with one of the greatest airlines in the world and needed to go to the loo on the plane, and found that there wasn't an aisle chair to take me to the toilet and back. So horrendous physical access there, which actually led me to having to crawl up and down the plane to use the bathroom and to get back to my seat. horrendously embarrassing for me, but also for, I think, other people on the plane as well, and just really showed what a difference my experience as a disabled person was to somebody who didn't have a disability in that particular journey. So physical and social access can be both good and bad, and I think where you least expect it to be brilliant, it sometimes is, and vice versa. I just wanted to come to the end of my presentation by talking to you about something called psycho-emotional disablement. Now, from this presentation, and I'm sure before this presentation, we all knew that good physical access would lead to, the majority of the time, a good experience for disabled people. But what we often forget is that good or bad access can also lead to an emotional response, and it can lead to a change in the well-being of the customer, the disabled customer. So I just want you to imagine for a second a scenario. I want you to imagine that you're with a partner or a friend. One of you is non-disabled, you're able to walk up steps and go through doorways and all of those things, and one of you is a wheelchair user or has a mobility impairment of some kind. And you go into a particularly amazing hotel, okay? There's a red carpet, up steps, up into a front doorway of this hotel. There's a chandelier in the entrance. There's members of staff there waiting to greet you and take your luggage from you and tell you what an amazing time you're going to have, okay? That is the entrance for most people, the 5-star entrance, the non-disabled entrance. And for the member of your party that's the wheelchair user or has mobility difficulties, which makes steps a bit of a no-go, you've got to go around to the car park at the back, which is full of rubbish, dirt, and is pretty grimy and grim, especially on this very wet day that you are visiting this hotel. So for the person that's the wheelchair user or is using some mobility aids, you've now got a pretty dirty piece of equipment. You've had to sail through some pretty horrible things that you're not sure really what they are on the floor, and your friend, your partner, has just had this most amazing experience getting into this hotel. Now, the emotional response that disabled person has got from that change in well-being, that change of how you are thought of or considered as a customer, is something called psycho-emotional disablement. It's your emotional response to something that really doesn't cut the mustard, okay? And so often when it comes to businesses who market themselves as accessible, you might have that kind of experience, but they'll say, oh, but we are step free. But you know, that person can go around to the car park and doesn't have to go up the steps. Well, yes, that might be true. The physical access is there, but what about that emotional experience and that feeling of being a valued customer? You know, that a business wants to their loyalty again. So again, just something to think about if you are a business, if you've got offices or a venue or a service to provide. Not only how are you providing that in terms of physical access, but what experience are you providing, and what kind of well-being and emotional response do you expect your customers or clients to have from what you're promoting? So just finally, I wanted to give a bit of a call to action to everybody and just talk a little bit around what you can do yourselves when it comes to access and inclusion and improving this business and ethical model that comes with good access and inclusion. And I think it's divided into 3 different sections: awareness, education, and implementation. So awareness, first of all, make sure that whatever you are putting out is accessible. So whether that's an accessible website promoting certain products, whether you're inviting customers, clients or delegates into an office, make sure that this is as accessible and inclusive as possible. And if not, make sure you're honest about it and you give as much information about the levels of accessibility you have as possible. Have a little think as well about what I said earlier, that disabled people are extremely loyal customers. So the best experience in terms of your own awareness and our accessibility you can give, the better. Secondly, look at education and invest in education wherever you possibly can. Are your staff trained in disability awareness? What about British Sign Language for deaf or hard of hearing customers or clients? And are you able to create any kind of resource that encourages staff to have that calm, confident communication that really does come with good social access? And remember, the more education you invest in, the more accessible you are going to be as a business, and you can probably start turning that around by recruiting disabled members of staff to really enable that to flourish even more, and to ensure that your workplace is not just offering inclusivity, but is actually an inclusive place to come and work as well. And the third point that I'd like to mention is implementation. So make sure that whatever you're putting out into the ether is as accessible and inclusive as possible. So that comes to writing blogs and tweeting. Make sure that your language is inclusive and really educate yourself around that. If you're running events, encourage disabled delegates to disclose their impairments, to disclose their needs, so that you are then able to provide as many inclusive equipments, ways of accessing different bits of information as you possibly can. That may well be hiring a British Sign Language interpreter for the day if you know you've got somebody who's deaf or hard of hearing coming along. These things are really important, and yes, they can cost a little bit of money, but again, you will reap those benefits as a business. And last point, wherever possible, try and partner with disabled people's organisations or accessible organisations. So again, you are educating yourself, learning wherever possible, and really enabling the access and inclusion in your business to flourish. Not just being a kind and ethical business, but also thinking about this great business model, the Purple Pound, and really engaging as much as possible with deaf and disabled clients and customers. So I hope this has helped. Thank you so much. If you would like to keep in touch with me, there are my details on the screen here. Please do follow what I'm doing if that interests you, and should you have any questions around how to further your own access and inclusion as a business, as an individual, or if you have any questions around consultancy or anything like that, please do get in touch with me, and thank you so much. I hope you enjoy the rest of the presentations that will be shown to you today. Thank you.
So I'll just start with thanking you, Emily, for agreeing to talk to us at the Major Projects Association. Thank you for your time. So I think my first question is how you got involved in as an accessibility consultant, and how did you get involved in the inclusive design world?
Okay, so it's a really nice story actually, and it's one of those very kind of serendipitous, lovely things that happened. So when I was at university, the 2016 Rio Games were coming up, and I just volunteered at the London 2012 Paralympics as a games maker. And the British consulate got in touch with me, who were based out in Rio, and asked if I'd like to kind of come along and talk about my experiences as a games maker for the people that were going to be running the 2016 Games in Rio. So I went and gave a presentation, and there was a man sat in the middle of the front row who was kind of nodding along at the right times, laughing at all my jokes at the right times, which was very nice. And about halfway through my presentation, he started looking at his phone and texting. And I thought, oh no, I've lost his attention, I've lost his interest, I'm not doing very well. And at the end of the presentation, where I spoke about my experience as a games maker, but also as a disabled person, as a wheelchair user, he stood up and he said that he worked for Metro Rio, which is the underground transport system that services Rio. And he said that they were in desperate need of somebody who had experience of disability and the needs of accessibility for the next couple of years when they were expanding their train network. And would I like to have an interview the following day? So that was how I got involved with Access Consultancy, and that was my first major job and project.
Amazing. That was straight out of university.
Yeah.
That was fantastic. So they relocated you to Rio, and how long were you there?
I was there, I worked 3 months on, 3 months off for 2.5 years.
That's amazing. And you said in your interview you talked about the culture there being so positive towards people with disabilities.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, don't get me wrong, the physical access there wasn't and arguably still isn't great when you compare it to the UK, the US. But what I think was amazing and continues to be brilliant is the mentality and perception that they have around disability is just very, very positive, in the sense that they don't seem to have this British awkwardness and worry that we have. If you're struggling, they'll just come and help you. And that was really nice and really refreshing, especially for somebody who, like you say, had just come out of uni, was on her own in a different country. It was really nice, and I found that I was able to make connections and friendships that way as well.
That's fantastic to hear. And I think so. My first question kind of leads on from that about why we as British people, why we struggle to talk to, you talked about 66% of people avoid actively talking to people with disabilities. And why do you think that we have that in our culture?
I think it comes out of good intention, mainly.
Yeah.
I think our good intention is we so desperately don't want to do or say the wrong thing. We are so worried about being patronising or offensive when it comes to disabled people. So, in effect, we end up saying and doing very little at all out of that fear. And I think that fear comes from a good place, but sometimes it isn't executed very well. And I think sometimes we just need to not worry about getting things wrong too much and instead go for it and be willing to be educated instead and do it better the next time.
I 100% agree. And I think it bleeds on to a lot of things in British society with regards to race and disabilities. We are very, very scared of offending people and therefore don't want to talk. I think one of the things is nomenclature, and we talked to Neil Smith around this, is how we refer to people in wheelchairs. I think there's a lot of some people don't like being called disabled. Some people don't like certain other words. What would you say to if somebody was to say, I'm really worried about saying the wrong word, and because it has really offended people in the past?
I would say that, as Neil probably very rightly said in his answers, that not everybody likes and dislikes the same thing. So sadly, for the people that are trying to learn, it is on a bit of a case-by-case basis, which isn't the most helpful thing to say, but it's true. Secondly, the thing that I'd say is there is actually so much information out there around terminology and what generally the correct terminology is to use. Educate yourself and be willing to educate yourself every 3 months or so, because let's be honest, this terminology changes very often. And I've run disability awareness training sessions with a great charity called Enhance the UK that I talk about in my presentation. And so often we've gone into training environments and somebody that just so happened to learn a little bit about disability or race or something else 20 years ago feels like they know all the answers now, and that's just not the case. It's just not how society works. So educate yourself frequently. Don't get too defensive if you get something wrong and somebody does try and correct you. And I think open and honest and frank communication really is the answer to a lot of these issues that we're facing at the moment.
I 100% agree. I think we need to definitely open up those channels of communication. There was a recent report I read that said that a lot of construction projects actually fail not because of the technical competence, but because project managers or project professionals weren't communicating with each other. So it's definitely something that we need to improve on. As an accessibility consultant, what what gripes do you hear from project managers or people working in infrastructure? What are the pitfalls we experience on projects, and why do we come to accessibility consultants?
I think one of the biggest pitfalls, and it can be summed up by a phrase that I really love, that is used a lot by disabled people's organisations, that goes, "Nothing about us without us," which I think is brilliant. I think the main pitfall is that we understand that access and inclusion is necessary and it's needed, but so often we don't think about it until later in the project when in fact it's too late. So then implementing access and inclusion becomes expensive, it becomes a chore, it becomes something that nobody wants to do or have to think about, when actually if we'd have done it first within design, for example, that would have made a big difference. And I think also it just goes back to what we've been talking about, really, the fear that comes so often with access and inclusion. And understandably, somebody who doesn't have any experience of disability doesn't quite know exactly how to implement things in the right way. And that's where somebody like me, with that lived experience of how things work practically, taken from a blueprint or a piece of paper and put into the real world, that's the difference that makes.
I think that's really important to get us, involved all the stakeholders at such an early stage to build those better business cases. So let's assume I'm a project manager in a small to medium client. What would you, and let's say I'm, a station or an airport, what would be my first port of call to communicate, with the different kind of stakeholders, wheelchair users in the local community? How would I even begin to do that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I always recommend that people start to grow a little black book almost of networks when it comes to people who have lived experience within minority groups, for example, or even if it's just experts in fields that you don't know a lot about personally. It's always great to have people that you build contacts and networks with, but actually will be willing to just advise on the odd little thing every now and again, or just answer a certain question. That's really, really helpful. And there's so many people out there that are willing to do that and really enjoy creating those networks themselves. Secondly, I think it's really valuable to get in touch with disabled people's organisations and local charities or national charities, because so often those charities are run by or have contact with people with lived experience who will be willing to sit on focus groups, who will be willing to be involved with filming a video that you might be doing or something like that. And then I would say your next stage is, if you actually want somebody with that lived experience to work with you and collaborate with you, that's when you would get somebody like an accessibility consultant involved. So I do think that there are stages there, and it's really important to engage with all of those stages.
No, I think you've laid it out very well in your presentation as well about the 3 steps on how we can get involved. And I think we hide behind sometimes an excuse, but there is so much out there, especially with the age of social media. We really can't be hiding ourselves behind the "I didn't know, I was ignorant" of this scenario, of this situation. Do you see there being a changing set of mindsets? Are we improving in the last 10 years, 5 years?
I think we are improving, absolutely. I still think that there's a way to go. And I think that there's probably now more of a way to go in how we value disabled people in a work environment. I think up until very recently, disabled people may have been consulted and they may have advised on certain things, but it's actually quite rare for a disabled person to be brought on for their expertise and compensated for that advice and that expertise. And I am starting to see a shift there in that happening, in terms of disabled people with lived experience being seen as valuable for having that experience. And I think that's so important and that's so positive.
No, 100%. Representation in the workplace, I guess, is your first port of call for that culture change, for it to be present rather than something that we can, push to the side. No, I'm glad you. I know we talk a lot about doom and gloom of the industry and how nothing's right, but it's good to see hear you saying that there are positive changes. With regards to, I guess now looking forward next 5 to 10 years, what would you like to see? So you'd obviously like to see better representation. What would you like to see in regards to infrastructure and transport and the way we move around the world?
That's a really good question. So there's a few things I think I would like to see businesses and individuals in the corporate world understanding the purple pound a little bit more and
Yep.
understanding really the main arc of my presentation, if you like, that becoming accessible and inclusive isn't just a nice thing to do. It isn't just a nice to have, but actually it's a really business savvy thing to do. It's a really profitable thing to do, because as disabled people, we still like to spend money just like anybody else, and that's really important to drill that home. And I think that will make a huge difference in how businesses are run, and how consumers move about and consume things differently. I think also what would be amazing. Oh, I've lost my train of thought now. Oh no, I knew this
We
would happen at some
No worries.
point.
We were talking about the future and what would you like to see? Maybe even tech. What do you think is going to really help us going forward? And
Oh yeah, this was my other point. uh, and the other thing that I think is really important to
yeah,
make sure is happening now, and I think will improve and evolve over the next 5 to 10 years, is the importance of inclusive design. So right from the very get-go, when you are starting a project, understanding that designing inclusively, designing for the most disabled customer you could possibly imagine, for example, or designing for a specific group of people that are really going to benefit from the piece of technology that you're thinking of designing. Having that inclusive design at the kind of core of whatever project you are working on will make sure that many, many different groups of people can benefit from that. And I just think that when that is really seen as important and vital and as a must rather than a nice to have, that will change again how businesses operate, but also how we consume as well.
definitely. And I think we're starting to get that data, like you said, of that purple pound, that financial element is becoming much more real and much more quantifiable. So I think that will help.
Yeah, definitely. I agree.
We can't avoid it, the elephant in the room. So COVID, how is it affecting your life, would you say, and how do you think it'll affect the industry?
Interesting. So I think personally for me, the one main thing that has changed is I'm not getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to leave Glasgow and fly to London for a job. And I can't say that I'm missing that, I have to be honest. So I'm finding that actually a lot of what I work on can be done from home. My other kind of non-consultancy part of work where I deliver disability awareness training is very, very highly affected, simply because the integrity of what we do is all based in face-to-face training and is all based in ensuring that delegates have that lived experience knowledge coming from their trainers. So that's something that we're currently working on. How can we deliver that in a non-face-to-face environment while still keeping that integrity and that impact? So when it comes to accessibility, different industries and avenues are affected differently, as I'm sure is the case everywhere else.
Definitely.
But for me, with consultancy, a lot I'm able to do at home, which is great. However, I personally think, nothing can really replace that beauty of face-to-face interaction, lived experience, and being able to really kind of go through the motions. For example, if I'm doing an audit of a train company, for example, I have to be able to be there to be able to do that and to really give it its full integrity. So I think there are some things that we are still having to go over those challenging hurdles a little bit.
So I think you touched on 2 points. Yeah, one, which is we're never going to be able to substitute that, interacting with the, infrastructure. But do you think it will make the barriers to entry of the workplace and to, you speaking to other people less now that we are moving towards a more digital world?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think we are understanding how inclusive the digital world can be, for sure. I mean, we've seen in the last 5, 10 years, for example, how when you think about it, when you're interviewing somebody who's deaf or hard of hearing, for example, the ability of being able to use Skype or any kind of video conferencing rather than going over the phone enables somebody to lip read and enables that interview to be more accessible. So I think that there's a lot that we can do and continue to do when it comes to the accessibility of the digital world and how that will affect how we recruit, how we retain staff, how we're able to be flexible. And of course, all of those things really matter to a lot of disabled people.
100%. And hopefully it'll make the workplace a bit better if, we don't all on the Monday morning cram into the central
Yeah.
line to get into London. So when we return to the new normal, as the government likes to put it, trains are going to be quieter. Um, However, there's going to be that increased risk of infection. So people traveling and using our network are going to be increasingly put at risk. How do you see that affecting, the world of people with different neuro or physical disabilities and their choice to travel?
I have been saying for some time actually and discussing with my partner that I think the new normal will take a lot longer to come to fruition for a lot of disabled people. I think in one respect we have an advantage during this lockdown in the sense that we're used to having to isolate ourselves. We're used to having to do things slightly differently. We're used to having to adapt. So I think we've had the advantage there. I think it will be very difficult for us to really work out again where the disabled community fits into society. And that's quite a scary thought. When non-disabled people are concentrating on going back to work and consuming again and all of these different things, that's brilliant and it's needed for society to run. But I do wonder where prioritization of safety, of health, of the most vulnerable in society will come into play, and whether it will at all, especially in a corporate environment.
No, everyone we've talked to has said this is it's going to be super challenging. It's going to be almost this, rush to work out what that new normal will look like and make sure that it is, inclusive for everyone.
Yeah, scary. I'll be honest, I've not really thought about it in too much detail until we've just had this conversation. I was thinking, yeah, it'll take a while, but I'm going to quite enjoy being at home for a little while, but it is quite scary, actually. Yeah, I'll be interested to watch all the other Q&As and see what everybody else says as well.
No, it definitely. We'll send all of that through. I think this kind of concludes my formal kind of interview-esque things. But if I've not brought anything up, let me know. If you want to talk about anything else, let me know.
No, that was great. Thank you so much.